How much emptiness can one heart hold before it just stops? The cold didn't just bite that morning. It chewed, gnawed at exposed skin, at the brittle edges of resolve. Frost, thick and white as bone, cracked under Ben's worn work boots with every slow, heavy step across the frozen yard. Each sharp sound echoed in the pre-dawn gray, a punctuation mark in the suffocating silence that had settled over Willow Creek Farm like a shroud. 6 months. 6 months since the cancer one, since Sarah's laugh stopped bouncing off these barn walls, leaving only this hollow roar of quiet. Wind whistled through a gap in the old stable roof, a mournful, tuneless sound that seemed to coil around the empty paddocks, around Ben's own ribs. He pulled his collar higher, the rough wool scratching his unshaven jaw. The air smelled of snow, of frozen earth, and beneath it, faint but stubborn, the ghost of hay and horse sweat. A scent that now only deepened the ache. He wasn't going to the main barn. Couldn't face the echoing emptiness where Sarah's bright bay gelding, Scout, used to nicker impatiently for breakfast. Sold him last month. Couldn't bear the daily reminder of shared joy turned to solitary chore. No, Ben's numb shuffle was taking him towards the back field, towards the run-down quarantine shed Sarah had always planned to renovate. A place he'd largely avoided since. But the county animal control officer had called yesterday, voice clipped with exhaustion. A mare. Found wandering Route 17 near the old Miller place. Half-frozen, skeletal. Owner, unavailable. Barn fire. Bad scene. Could Ben hold her? Just for a few days? Shelter was bursting. He'd said yes. Habit. Duty. Maybe just something to fill the crushing hours. The quarantine shed loomed, its weathered boards bleached gray in the weak morning light. Icicles hung like jagged teeth from the sagging eaves. Ben fumbled with the heavy padlock, his gloved fingers clumsy with cold and something deeper, a reluctance. He didn't need this. Didn't need another creature's suffering mirroring his own. The metal chain rattled, a harsh, lonely sound. He heaved the sliding door open just enough to slip inside, the groan of rusted metal scraping against wood setting his teeth on edge. Darkness. And cold. Colder than outside, somehow damp and still. The smell hit him first, not the clean scent of hay, but the sharp tang of neglect. Urine. Old manure. Dust. And beneath it, the sour metallic scent of fear and emptiness. His eyes adjusted slowly. Weak light filtered through a high, cobwebbed window, dust motes dancing in the thin beams. He scanned the shadows of the small, cluttered space, discarded tools, stacked burlap sacks, an old wheelbarrow tipped on its side. Then he saw her. In the farthest corner, where the shadows pooled deepest, stood a shape that seemed less horse, more ghost. An Arabian mare, or what remained of one. Her coat, once likely a burnished copper, was dull, matted with mud and patches of snowmelt that had frozen again into clumps. It hung loose over a skeletal frame. Every rib stood out like a blade under her skin. Her hip bones jutted sharply, grotesque angles in the gloom. Her spine was a stark ridge you could have balanced a coin on. Emaciated wasn't the word. It was desecration. But it was her head that stopped Ben's breath. Held unnaturally high, despite the obvious weakness trembling through her legs. A long, elegant neck, still carrying the proud arch of her breed, but stretched thin over protruding vertebrae. Her face, gaunt doesn't cover it. Hollows plunged deep beneath enormous, dark eyes. Eyes that held the entire frozen landscape of Ben's own grief reflected back at him, magnified 1,000 times. Not just fear, though that was there, a flicker in the immense darkness of her pupils. Not just pain, though it radiated from every trembling line of her. It was vacancy. A profound, terrifying absence. Like the light inside had been snuffed out, leaving only this shell, this monument to loss, staring sightlessly into the shadows of the shed. She didn't move. Didn't startle at his entrance. Just stood, frozen as the ice outside, her breath pluming in faint, ragged wisps in the frigid air. The only sound was the frantic hammering of Ben's own heart against his ribs, suddenly loud in the suffocating silence. He'd seen neglected animals before, but this felt different. This felt like looking into an abyss. Her stillness wasn't calm. It was the stillness of something already broken beyond repair. The stillness of giving up. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots scuffing the frozen dirt floor. The mare flinched. Not a jump, just the faintest tremor rippling through her emaciated frame, a ripple of tension in the profound stillness. Her head turned a fraction, just enough for one enormous, dark eye to fix on him. Not with aggression, not even with curiosity, just awareness. A dull, exhausted acknowledgement of another presence in her private void. There was no spark, no life behind that gaze. Just the reflection of the shed's gloom and Ben's own stunned silhouette. He stopped, rooted to the spot. The feed bucket in his hand, a meager scoop of senior mash the vet had recommended, felt suddenly absurd, insultingly inadequate. What could this handful of grain do against this? Against the sheer, staggering mountain of suffering this creature embodied? The cold air burned in his lungs. The familiar numbness that had been his armor these past months cracked. Just a hairline fracture, letting in a terrifying rush of raw, useless pity. He'd said yes to holding her. But holding what? Holding on to what was clearly already lost? He remembered Sarah's voice, bright and sure, talking about Willow Creek becoming a sanctuary someday. Everyone deserves a soft landing, Ben. Especially the broken ones. He looked at the ghost horse in the corner, a creature sculpted from starvation and despair. A landing? This felt like the edge of a cliff. He set the bucket down slowly, the dull clank of metal on frozen earth unnervingly loud. He took one more step, then another, moving with the exaggerated care one uses near something infinitely fragile. Or infinitely dangerous. He stopped a few feet away, outside the invisible circle of her profound isolation. He didn't speak. What words could possibly matter here? He just stood. Breathed. Trying to project calm, he didn't feel into the frigid, fear-scented air. For a long moment, nothing changed. The mare remained a statue carved from shadow and bone, her gaze fixed somewhere past him, through him. The wind moaned outside, rattling the loose boards of the shed. Ben felt the familiar weight of his grief settle heavier, mingling with this new, overwhelming wave of helplessness. Why had he agreed? What was the point? He was just another transient shadow in this creature's nightmare. He should turn around. Walk out. Call animal control back. Tell them to take her. Spare them both this. Then it happened. So subtle he almost missed it. A flicker. Not in her eyes, still dark and depthless, but in the ragged, frost-tipped ear closest to him. It twitched. Just once. A tiny, involuntary tremor. Not towards a sound outside. Not in fear. But towards him. Towards the low, unconscious sigh that had escaped Ben's own lips as the weight of it all pressed down. It lasted less than a second. Then the ear stilled, frozen again. But the impression remained. A microscopic shift in the absolute desolation. A single, frayed thread of connection, gossamer thin, trembling in the frozen air between a broken man and a shattered horse. Ben didn't move, didn't breathe. The emptiness in the shed, in his own chest, felt suddenly different. Not less vast, but charged. As if that tiny, involuntary flicker of an ear had dropped a single, impossible pebble into an ocean of despair, sending ripples across the surface of the impossible. The question wasn't if she would survive. It felt like asking if dust could remember being stone. The question, hanging thick and unspoken in the frozen air between them, was far simpler, far more terrifying. Could anything this broken ever truly come back? The clink of the feed bucket hitting frozen earth became Ben's alarm clock. Dawn after dawn, he'd shuffle through the gray light, frost crunching like shattered glass underfoot, the wind still howling its mournful tune through the pines. He'd slide open the quarantine shed door, that familiar groan of rusted metal a grim fanfare, and step into the smell of damp straw, antiseptic salve, and the lingering sourness of fear. And there she'd be, the ghost horse, the monument to loss, standing in her corner, a silhouette carved from shadow and sharp angles. He'd learned not to look directly into those enormous, dark eyes first thing. The vacancy there, it mirrored the hollow space behind his own ribs too perfectly. It threatened to swallow him whole. He'd focus instead on the ritual, scooping the precisely measured senior mash, high-fat, high-calorie, the vet's orders, into the rubber tub. The shush-shush sound of the grain was the only conversation. He'd place it just inside the door, then retreat several paces, leaning against the cold wall stacked with burlap sacks, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Waiting, watching her ribs heave with each shallow, effortful breath. The first few days, she hadn't moved towards the food until he'd left the shed entirely, the door groaning shut behind him. He'd watch through a crack, see her approach the bucket with the trembling caution of a creature expecting a trap, head jerking up at every imagined sound, ears pinned flat one moment, swiveling wildly the next. Then, one brittle morning, something shifted. He'd placed the bucket down, retreated as usual, the cold wall biting through his jacket. He braced for the long wait, the eventual shuffle towards the food only after his exit. But she didn't wait. Her head lifted, not with the high, terrified arch of before, but a lower, more deliberate movement. One emaciated foreleg, knobbed knee trembling visibly, stepped forward. Then another. Her movement wasn't fluid, wasn't horse-like grace. It was the agonizing, mechanical unfolding of something long frozen. Crackle, crunch. Her hooves, overgrown and chipped, disturbed the thin layer of frost on the shed floor. Ben held his breath. He didn't move a muscle, didn't even blink. She stopped halfway to the bucket, head swinging towards him. Those dark eyes fixed on his face. Not vacant this time. Assessing, calculating the risk. The silence stretched, thick and cold, broken only by the frantic drumming of Ben's pulse in his ears and the mare's ragged breathing. He did the only thing that felt natural. He lowered his gaze, looked down at his worn boots, then slowly, deliberately, turned his head slightly away, exposing the line of his neck. A submissive gesture in the silent language of prey animals. I'm not a threat. See, I'm looking away. He heard the soft crunch of another step. Then another. He kept his gaze averted, fixed on a knot in the wooden wall, but his peripheral vision caught the blur of her skeletal frame moving closer. The smell of her stale sweat, healing sores, the medicinal tang of the salve on her raw hip bones, grew stronger. He heard the soft snuffle as she dipped her head towards the bucket, then the rhythmic, desperate crunch, crunch, crunch as she ate. fast, terrified it might disappear. Ben stayed perfectly still, statue still, until the rhythmic crunching slowed, then stopped. He risked a glance. She was licking the empty tub, her head still low, one wary eye fixed on him. He saw the faintest tremor run through her sunken flanks. Not fear this time. Exhaustion. The simple act of walking those few steps and eating had cost her dearly. Without thinking, Ben exhaled slowly, a long, soft sigh that fogged the air. Her near ear, the one that had flicked towards him that first day, twitched. Just once. Towards the sound of his breath. It was nothing. Everything. The thaw was glacial, measured in spoonfuls of mash and inches of trust. Ben stopped leaning against the wall. He started sitting on an overturned bucket a few feet inside the door, his back to her as she ate. He'd stare out the cracked shed door at the gray expanse of the back field, the skeletal trees clawing at the sky. He didn't speak. What was there to say to this broken creature? His own brokenness felt too loud, too jagged, to put into words near her profound silence. But his mind churned. Sitting there, the cold seeping through his jeans, the rhythmic sound of her chewing the only anchor in the quiet, the dam holding back his grief began to leak. Sarah would know what to do, the thought surfaced, unbidden and sharp as ice. She'd be humming some off-key tune, moving slow and easy, telling this poor soul it was going to be okay, believing it. A wave of loss, fresh and brutal, crashed over him. His throat tightened. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against them. He hadn't cried since the funeral. Not really. The numbness had been a shield. But here, in this cold shed with this shattered horse, the shield felt thin. Useless. A single, hot tear escaped, tracing a path down his stubbled cheek. He wiped it away roughly, angry at its betrayal. He heard a soft snort behind him. He froze, mortified. Had she seen? Heard? He didn't turn. Minutes passed. Only the wind and her breathing. Then, a sound he hadn't heard before. A soft, almost inaudible blow through her nostrils. Not a snort of alarm. Softer. Like a sigh. Like recognition? Ben risked turning his head, just slightly. She wasn't looking at him. Her head was lowered, her eyes half closed, but her ears were pricked forward. Not tense. Relaxed. As if listening, not to the wind, but to the echo of his sorrow hanging in the air. As if acknowledging its presence. A shared silence, heavy with unspoken pain. The vet, Dr. Evans, came weakly. A no-nonsense woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. "Progress, Ben," she'd murmur, running skilled fingers over the mare's jutting ribs, checking the healing sores. "Slow, but progress. Call her anything yet." Ben shook his head. Naming her felt presumptuous. Like claiming a storm cloud. Dr. Evans filled a syringe with vitamins. "She needs a name, Ben. Helps them. Helps us. This one. She's got spirit buried deep. Arabians do. Like phoenixes." The needle went in. The mare flinched, a violent tremor running through her, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes, wide and white-rimmed, fixed on Ben, standing at her head, holding the lead rope loosely. He instinctively raised a hand, not to touch her, but to block her view of the needle, a shield. Her breathing, rapid and shallow, hitched. Then, as Dr. Evans withdrew the needle, the mare did something astonishing. She turned her head, just slightly, and pressed her bony, velvety muzzle against the back of Ben's hand where it held the rope. Not a nudge for food. Not a startle. A deliberate, fleeting touch. Seeking contact? Reassurance? Ben's breath caught. The feel of her skin, surprisingly warm despite the cold shed, the coarse hairs, the faint tremor still vibrating through her. It burned against his skin. He didn't pull away. He let her muzzle rest there for a heartbeat, too, before she slowly withdrew, her breath puffing warm against his frozen knuckles. "See," Dr. Evans said softly, packing her bag. "Spirit. Buried deep, but there. Grace under pressure. You should call her Gracie." The name hung in the cold air. Gracie. It didn't feel forced. It felt found, like uncovering a smooth stone in frozen mud. Ben didn't confirm, but the name settled inside him. Gracie. Routines deepened, woven with fragile threads of understanding. Ben started grooming her. Not properly at first. Just a soft rubber curry comb, working in small, tentative circles on the least sensitive areas he could find. The crest of her neck, the solid plane of her shoulder where muscle was slowly, painfully beginning to knit back over bone. The first time, she'd flinched violently, skittering sideways, eyes rolling. Ben froze, curry comb held aloft like a guilty trophy. He waited, lowered the comb, spoke for the first time directly to her, his voice rough from disuse. "Easy, easy now. Just dust." He didn't know why he said it. It just came out. "Low. Come." He raised the comb again, impossibly slow. She watched him, nostrils flaring, but she didn't move away. He touched the rubber to her neck, the lightest pressure. A tremor ran through her, but she held her ground. He made one small circle. Swish. The sound of the rubber against her dull, matted coat. Then another. And another. Her head lowered, inch by inch. Her eyes half closed. Her breathing, for the first time since she'd arrived, deepened into something resembling calm. In, out. In, out. Ben found himself matching his own breath to hers. In, out. The rhythmic swish of the curry comb, the shared rhythm of breath, the weak winter sun finally finding its way through the high window and painting a pale stripe across her back. It created a pocket of stillness in the world. A fragile sanctuary. He started talking. Not about big things. Not about Sarah. Not about the yawning emptiness of the farmhouse. Mundane things. The price of hay. The stubborn ice on the water trough. The way the crows argued in the big oak tree. His voice was a low rumble, unfamiliar even to his own ears. Gracie would stand, head low, ears flicking back towards him as he spoke, then swiveling forward, then back again. Listening. Absorbing the sound of him, the vibration. Sometimes, while he curried, she'd stretch her neck out, her lips trembling slightly, reaching towards his boot or the edge of his jacket, not to nip, but to explore. To touch. The first time her whiskers brushed the back of his wrist as he worked on her shoulder, he froze again. Not in fear. In awe. It was the lightest touch, gossamer fine, yet it carried the weight of a seismic shift. Her trust, tentative as a spider's thread, had found its first anchor point. On him. One afternoon, the weak sun actually held some warmth. Ben slid the shed door fully open for the first time, flooding the space with pale, watery light. He'd been leading Gracie in small circles inside the shed for days, building strength in her trembling legs. Today, he stopped just inside the doorway. The vast expanse of the back field stretched out, blanketed in dirty snow, the fence line visible in the distance. freedom, or terror. He held the lead rope loosely, standing beside her. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring wide, sucking in great draughts of cold, fresh air. Her ears pricked forward, rigid, scanning the horizon. Ben felt the tension coiling in her body, vibrating through the lead rope. She took a hesitant step forward, her hoof landing just outside the shed, on the frozen ground. She stopped, snorted, looked back at the dim, familiar safety of the shed, then looked out again. The wind ruffled the sparse hairs of her mane. Ben stayed quiet. Phil. This was her choice. He saw the conflict play out in her muscles, in the minute shifts of her weight, in the flickering intensity of her gaze. Fear warred with a dawning, ancient instinct. To move. To be under the sky. She took another step. Then another. Soon, she stood fully outside the shed, trembling, head high, eyes wide, but standing. Ben walked slowly forward with her, letting the rope slide through his fingers, giving her space. She took a few more tentative steps into the open. She stopped, lowered her head, sniffed the snow. Then, with a suddenness that startled Ben, she dropped her head lower, her neck stretching out, and she lipped at a patch of exposed frozen grass. Just a touch. Then she raised her head again, looking around, as if surprised she was still alive. A small puff of steam escaped her nostrils. Ben felt an unfamiliar sensation tug at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Hope, fragile as an early crocus pushing through snow. Weeks bled into a month. Gracie's ribs were still visible, but they no longer looked like they'd sliced through her skin. A faint gloss began to show through the mud stains on her copper coat. Her eyes, they weren't vacant anymore. They were watchful, deep, intelligent, haunted, yes, but present. Ben found himself lingering longer in the shed after chores. Sitting on the overturned bucket, not just while she ate, but just being. Watching her doze, her lower lip drooping slightly, a sign of deep relaxation he'd never seen before. He'd talk more. Sometimes about Sarah. Small memories. The way she'd burned their first Thanksgiving turkey. The ridiculous hat she'd worn to the county fair. He'd feel a lump in his throat, but it was a different ache now. Sharper, perhaps, but cleaner. Gracie would often stand close, her shoulder near his knee, her breath warm on his leg, her ears canted towards the sound of his voice. A silent witness. One raw, twilight evening, the sky bruised purple and orange, Ben finished mucking out the shed corner. He gave Gracie's neck a final absent-minded scratch, a gesture that had become routine, one she now leaned into with a soft sigh, and turned to leave. He slid the heavy door mostly shut, leaving the customary gap for air, and started the trudge back towards the distant lights of the farmhouse. The cold bit deep. His thoughts were already turning to the silent kitchen, the cold leftovers, the echoing rooms. He heard it behind him. Not the usual soft shuffle or snort from inside the shed. A distinct crunch, crunch, crunch on the frozen path. He stopped, turned slowly. Gracie stood just outside the shed door, the pale light framing her silhouette. She'd pushed through the gap. She stood there, looking at him across the 20 feet of frozen yard that separated them. Her breath plumed in the dusk. She took one tentative step forward, then another. Ben didn't move, didn't call her, didn't raise a hand. He just stood, his own breath held. She walked towards him. Not with her old, mechanical stiffness. There was a new fluidity, a hesitant grace returning to her movements. She stopped a few feet away, her dark eyes searching his face in the fading light. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind and the pounding of Ben's heart. He took a slow step towards the farmhouse. She took a step forward, matching him. He took another. So did she. He kept walking, the path familiar beneath his boots. He didn't look back, but he listened. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Her steps, steady now, keeping pace behind him. They reached the gate that separated the backfield from the main yard, near the empty paddocks and the silent main barn. Ben unlatched it, pushed it open, and stepped through. He turned. Gracie stood at the threshold, her muzzle just inches from the gate frame. She looked past him, towards the looming shadow of the main barn, then back at the path leading to her shed. Her ears flickered back and forth. Ben saw the tension return to her frame, the ghost of old fear flickering in her eyes. He waited. This was her line, her boundary. He took a few steps into the yard, towards the house. "Come on, then," he murmured, the words soft, almost lost in the wind. He didn't expect her to cross. The barn. It represented something unknown, something potentially terrifying. He kept walking, steeling himself for the sound of her retreating hooves crunching back towards the shed. It didn't come. He stopped near the back porch light, its yellow glow spilling onto the packed snow. He turned. Gracie stood just inside the gate, which she'd nudged wider. She wasn't looking at the barn anymore. She was looking at him, at the circle of light around him. She took one step, then another. Deliberate, purposeful. She walked across the open yard, the sound of her hooves loud in the twilight quiet, until she stood directly in the spill of the porch light, facing him. She lowered her head, not in submission, but in a gesture of arrival. Her warm breath fogged the air between them, mingling with his own. She didn't nudge him, didn't ask for food. She simply stood there, close, her shoulder almost touching his arm, her presence a solid warm weight in the cold evening. Her dark eye held his, reflecting the porch light, holding an unspoken question, a quiet declaration. She had followed him home. Not to the shed. To him. The boundary wasn't the gate. It was her fear. And tonight, step by hesitant step, she had crossed it. The emptiness around Ben, the vast silence of Willow Creek, didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, shared. He reached out, slowly, his bare fingers hovering near her neck, then sinking into the thick, coarse hair just below her mane. She sighed, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through her body and into his fingertips. He didn't speak. Words were too small for the enormity of the quiet understanding settling over them, as deep and still as the winter night. The question hanging in the air wasn't about survival anymore. It was simpler, more profound. What happens when two lost souls realize they're no longer walking alone? Spring arrived at Willow Creek not with a fanfare of blossoms, but with a slow, muddy sigh. The frost retreated, leaving behind fields of churned earth and patches of stubborn gray ice hiding in the shadows. The wind lost its winter bite, carrying instead the damp scent of thawing soil and the tentative chirp of returning red-winged blackbirds. Gracie's transformation was visible now, no longer a desperate clawing back from the brink, but a steady ascent. Her copper coat, meticulously curried by Ben each morning, gleamed with a deep, burnished warmth under the strengthening sun. Muscle flowed smoothly over ribs that were still defined but no longer predatory. Her neck regained its proud Arabian arch, her movements fluid and strong as she navigated the small paddock Ben had fenced off near the quarantine shed, her domain, her safe ground. She trod along the fence line when Ben approached, nickering softly, a sound that had evolved from a rasp to a clear, warm vibration that settled somewhere deep in Ben's chest. She met him at the gate, pushing her velvety muzzle into his palm before he could even offer the apple slice that had become their ritual. Life had found a rhythm. Dawn chores. The rhythmic scrape of the manure fork. The satisfying thump of fresh hay bales. Gracie's warm breath on his neck as he checked her water. Evenings spent sitting on an upturned bucket just outside her paddock, watching the sunset bleed orange and purple over the fields, Gracie grazing contentedly nearby, her tail swishing lazily at the first brave flies. He'd talk. More than before. About Sarah, yes, the ache still present, a familiar stone in his pocket, but also about the farm, the stubborn tractor, the plans for fixing the north pasture fence. Gracie would lift her head, ears swiveling towards his voice, her dark eyes soft, listening. It felt peaceful, like the world had finally stopped tilting. Then came the barn. The main barn. Sarah's barn. Scout's barn. It sat like a silent, brooding giant across the yard, its red paint faded, its doors perpetually closed since Ben had sold Scout. He'd avoided it, a monument to a happiness too sharp to examine. But practicality pressed in. The quarantine shed was too small for Gracie long-term, especially as she grew stronger. The main barn had sturdy stalls, good ventilation, a proper tack room. It was time. One bright, crisp morning, the air smelling of damp earth and new growth, Ben decided to air it out. He slid the heavy wooden door open with a protesting groan. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, flooded the aisle. The smell hit him. Old hay, leather oil, the faint, ghostly sweetness of molasses from long-gone treats, and beneath it, the lingering, comforting scent of horse. It was a punch to the gut. Memories flooded in, vivid and brutal. Sarah laughing as Scout playfully tugged her braid, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of him kicking his stall door for breakfast, the warm weight of his head resting trustingly on Ben's shoulder. The emptiness now was deafening. Ben leaned against the doorframe, blinking hard, waiting for the wave of grief to recede. He hadn't brought Gracie. She was dozing in her paddock under the weak sun. But as he stepped into the cool dimness of the barn, he heard it, a high-pitched, panicked whinny from outside. Sharp, unmistakable. He turned. Gracie was at her paddock fence, rigid, head held unnaturally high, nostrils flared wide, sucking in great draughts of air. Not towards him. Towards the open barn door. Her eyes were wide, white showing all around the dark irises. Terror. Pure, primal terror radiated from her taut frame. "Easy, girl," Ben called, his voice tight with his own unexpected emotion. "Just airing it out. It's okay." He took a step back towards the doorway, trying to appear non-threatening. Gracie didn't move. She stared past him, into the barn's shadowy depths, as if seeing something he couldn't. A low, rumbling snort vibrated in her chest, a sound of pure warning. Her ears were pinned flat back against her skull. Ben had seen her scared before, of sudden noises, of unfamiliar objects, but this was different. This was visceral, paralyzing. He quickly slid the barn door mostly shut, leaving only a narrow crack. The moment the opening narrowed, Gracie's rigid stance softened, fractionally. The whites of her eyes receded, though the terror didn't vanish. It simmered just beneath the surface, her breath still coming in rapid puffs. Ben walked slowly towards her paddock. She watched him approach, her body tense, ready to flee, but her eyes flickered between his face and the barn door. He stopped at the fence, offering his hand, palm up. She didn't nuzzle it. She stretched her neck, sniffed his fingers cautiously, then jerked her head back, her gaze darting again to the barn. A shiver ran visibly through her flanks. The refusal became absolute. Any attempt to lead her near the main barn, even just to the gate of the adjacent paddock, triggered the same cascade of panic. She'd plant her feet, a tremor starting in her hind legs, her head swinging away, eyes rolling. If he persisted, she'd rear, a small, desperate hop, her hooves skittering on the ground, a raw, guttural sound escaping her throat. Not a whinny, but a choked cry of pure refusal. It wasn't stubbornness. It was terror carved into her very bones. Ben stopped trying. He couldn't bear the look in her eyes. He focused on reinforcing the quarantine shed, making it more comfortable. But the barn's shadow now hung over their fragile peace. It was a physical manifestation of something unspoken, a barrier Gracie could not cross. Why? Was it just the unfamiliarity? The echoes of other horses? Or something deeper, darker, tied to the trauma she'd endured? The fragmented story from animal control surfaced in Ben's mind. Owner unavailable. Barn fire. Bad scene. He'd pushed it aside, focused on the immediate crisis of her body. Now, the words took on a sinister weight. Subtle patterns emerged, deepening the unease. Gracie, who had grown comfortable grazing near the path leading towards the main barn, began actively avoiding that corner of her paddock. She'd stand rigid, staring towards the barn, not with curiosity, but with a fixed, watchful intensity, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as if testing the wind for a specific scent. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the shadows lengthened, she'd pace the fence line closest to the barn, a slow, restless walk, her head low, her tail clamped tight. Not the playful trot she displayed when anticipating Ben, but a movement fraught with tension, like a sentinel on guard. One drizzly afternoon, Ben found her not pacing, but standing perfectly still near the back of her shed, her head lowered. She was using her upper lip, with delicate, focused precision, to scratch at a particular spot on the rough wooden wall. Not a casual rub. A deliberate, repeated motion, back and forth, over a patch of wood already worn smoother than the surrounding planks. He watched her for a long moment. The rain pattered softly on the roof. Her focus was absolute, almost trance-like. When he softly called her name, she startled violently, whipping her head around, her eyes wide with something that looked like guilt? Shame. She quickly turned away, pretending to sniff the ground. The outside world intruded, sharpening the mystery. Old Man Henderson, their nearest neighbor, stopped by the fence one day while Ben was repairing a post. He leaned on the rails, chewing a stem of grass, his eyes on Gracie, who stood watchfully at the far end of her paddock, her gaze fixed on the main barn. "Heard you took in that Miller mare," Henderson said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," Ben replied, hammering a nail with more force than necessary. "Bad business, that." Henderson spat. "Whole damn thing. Fancy barn like that?" Poof. He snapped his fingers. "And Old Man Miller, well." He shook his head, a grim finality in the gesture. "Heard she got out before the worst of it. Smart creature. Or lucky." He squinted at Gracie. "Looks good on her now. You done right by her, Ben." "What happened?" Ben asked, the question out before he could stop it. He hadn't wanted to know. Hadn't wanted to drag the darkness into Gracie's fragile light. Henderson's face closed down. Fire Marshal called it suspicious. Miller, well, he weren't found right away. Not till after. He looked away, uncomfortable. Like I said. Bad business. Horse probably saw things no creature ought to see. He pushed off the fence. Keep her away from that barn of yours, I reckon. Place gives me the creeps now, just thinkin' about it. He ambled off, leaving Ben frozen, the hammer heavy in his hand. Suspicious. Not found right away. Saw things. The words landed like stones in the pit of Ben's stomach. He looked at Gracie, still staring at the barn. Her watchfulness wasn't just fear. It was vigilance. Memory. Ben found himself resisting the pull of her past. He didn't look up the news reports Henderson's words hinted at. He avoided driving past the charred remains of the Miller place, visible from the ridge road. He focused fiercely on the present, Gracie's strengthening muscles, the shine returning to her mane, the way she now greeted him with a soft nicker and a gentle nudge, searching his pockets for carrots. He buried himself in farm work, the physical exhaustion a welcome numbness. But Gracie's silent testimony was relentless. Her reaction to the name Miller was chilling. Ben accidentally mentioned it while talking to Dr. Evans during a checkup near the paddock. Miller's vet bills were astronomical, I heard, he'd said, discussing feed costs. Gracie, who had been dozing nearby, snapped her head up. Her entire body stiffened. Her ears flattened instantly. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in her chest, a sound Ben had never heard from her. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Evans for a split second, wide and blazing with something akin to hatred, before she spun away, trotting stiffly to the far corner of the paddock, her tail held high and rigid. Dr. Evans raised an eyebrow. Well, she said quietly, she remembers the name. And whatever it's tied to, it wasn't good, Ben. The tension coiled tighter within Ben. His own grief, which had softened into a bittersweet ache in Gracie's presence, began to curdle into something darker. Anger. At the unknown perpetrator of the fire? At Miller for whatever neglect might have preceded it? At the universe for piling this horror onto this innocent creature? And guilt. Guilt for his own resistance, for wanting to protect his fragile peace by ignoring the screaming truth in Gracie's eyes and her rigid refusal to step near the barn. He started having trouble sleeping. The image of Gracie scratching that wall, her intense focus, haunted him. What was she trying to uncover or remember? He found himself drawn to the main barn despite himself. He'd open the door just a crack and stand inside the cool, shadowy aisle, breathing in the scent of dust and memory. He'd look at Scout's old stall, the door still bearing the scar from his enthusiastic kicks. The silence pressed in, heavy and accusing. He started noticing things he hadn't before. A faint, lingering smell of smoke, not wood smoke, but acrid and chemical, buried deep in the old hayloft. A dark, irregular stain on the concrete floor near the tackroom door that wouldn't scrub out. He'd shiver, though the barn wasn't cold. Gracie's terror started to feel contagious. One evening, the breaking point approached. A late spring storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. Thunder cracked like gunshots overhead, shaking the farmhouse. Rain lashed the windows. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard in stark, terrifying bursts. Ben, jolted awake, thought immediately of Gracie. The shed was sturdy, but she hated storms. He threw on a raincoat and ran out into the maelstrom, the wind tearing at his clothes, rain stinging his face. He slid the shed door open. Gracie was a whirlwind of panic inside. She wasn't trembling. She was vibrating. Sweat darkened her coat despite the chill. She paced frantically, crashing into the walls, her eyes rolling wildly, showing the whites all around. She screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the roar of the storm. It wasn't fear of thunder. It was the sound of a creature reliving hell. "Gracie, easy. It's just a storm," Ben yelled, trying to be heard over the din. He stepped inside, holding out his hands. She didn't see him. She was trapped in another place, another time. The flickering lightning, the concussive thunder, it was triggering a memory far worse than bad weather. She spun, her haunches slamming into the wall. She screamed again, the sound raw and desperate. Ben acted on instinct. He didn't try to grab her. He moved slowly towards the corner she'd scratched, the spot she'd focused on with such intensity. He crouched down, his back to her panic, and placed his palm flat against the worn patch of wood. He closed his eyes, blocking out the storm, the chaos. He focused on the feel of the grain under his hand. He started talking, his voice low and steady, a desperate anchor thrown into her storm. "Easy, easy now. You're safe, Gracie. You're safe here. It's Ben. Just Ben. The storm, it's loud, but it's outside. Outside the walls. You're inside. Safe. Walls are strong." He repeated it, a mantra against the thunder and her screams. Safe inside. Strong walls. Just Ben here. Safe. He kept his hand pressed to the wood, his eyes closed, pouring every ounce of calm he didn't feel into his voice, into the touch on the wall she had marked. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the frantic pacing stopped. The screams subsided into ragged, panting breaths. He heard a soft, hesitant step behind him. Then another. He didn't turn. He kept talking, his voice softer now. "Safe, Gracie. Safe." He felt warm breath on the back of his neck. Then the lightest, trembling touch. The velvety softness of her muzzle pressed against his shoulder blade. Just for a second. A seeking of contact. A desperate grasp for the anchor he offered. She stood behind him, shivering violently, her breath hot and rapid on his rain-soaked back, but she was with him again. Not lost in the memory. The storm still raged outside, but inside the shed, a fragile silence descended, thick with shared terror and the first tentative thread of something else. A shared understanding of walls, real and remembered. The next morning dawned clear and washed clean. Ben went to the shed early. Gracie was calm, eating her mash, though the lines around her eyes seemed deeper, the haunted look momentarily sharper. He walked to the back corner, to the spot she'd scratched. He ran his fingers over the smooth patch of wood. On impulse, he pressed harder, pushing. A small section of the old, weathered board, already weakened by time and her persistent attention, splintered and gave way near the bottom. Not much. Just a jagged hole, big enough to slide a few fingers through. Ben knelt. Curious, driven by a need he couldn't name, he reached into the dark gap behind the board. His fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood or insulation. Something flat, stiff, papery. He carefully drew it out. It was a fragment of a newspaper, yellowed, brittle, and stained with what looked like old smoke and water damage. It had been folded small, wedged deep into the wall cavity. His heart hammered against his ribs as he carefully unfolded the fragile scrap. The headline was partially torn, but the words screamed out from the smudged print. Local man perishes in suspicious barn blaze. Firefighters discover body of prominent horse breeder Arthur Miller in ruins. Prized Arabian mare missing. The date at the top of the fragment was clearly visible. Ben's blood ran cold. It was exactly 1 year ago yesterday. The day of the storm. The anniversary of the fire. He stared at the brittle paper in his shaking hand, then at the hole in the wall. Gracie had been scratching here. Not randomly. Not idly. She'd been scratching at the spot where this piece of her past, her horror, was hidden. Had she known it was there? Or was she drawn to the memory imprinted on this space, this wall? The implications crashed over him, cold and terrifying. She hadn't just escaped the fire. She had witnessed it. And she remembered everything. The peaceful rhythm of Willow Creek Farm lay shattered. The question hanging in the damp morning air wasn't just about Gracie's past anymore. It was a knife poised over their fragile present. How deep do the scars go? And can any shelter truly be strong enough to hold back the firestorm of memory? The brittle scrap of newspaper felt like live embers in Ben's palm. The words, blurred by smoke stains and time, pulsed with a terrible energy. Perishes in suspicious barn blaze. Arthur Miller. Prized Arabian mare missing. The date, 1 year ago yesterday, slammed into him like a physical blow, syncing perfectly with the storm that had ripped Gracie apart. He stared at the jagged hole in the shed wall, the splintered edges stark against the weathered wood. She hadn't been idly scratching. She'd been digging. For this? For the memory sealed behind the plank? Or had the scent of smoke, the vibration of thunder, simply unlocked a vault she couldn't control? A cold sweat broke out across Ben's back, unrelated to the morning chill creeping into the shed. He carefully refolded the fragment, its edges crumbling, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. It pressed against his chest, a tiny, burning brand. He looked at Gracie. She stood by her water bucket, head lowered, seemingly calm, chewing a mouthful of hay. But Ben saw it now. The tension humming just beneath the surface, the way her ears flickered constantly, scanning for threats only she could perceive. The haunted depth in her eyes wasn't just sadness, it was the residue of witnessing annihilation. She saw him die. The fragile piece of Willow Creek shattered. The routines, scooping grain, filling water, the rhythmic scrape of the manure fork, became fraught. Every glance Gracie cast towards the main barn wasn't just fear, it was recognition. A silent scream. Ben found himself flinching at sudden noises, jumping at shadows in the barn aisle when he reluctantly ventured in for tools. The smell of damp earth now carried an undercurrent of imagined smoke. He avoided Henderson. He couldn't bear the confirmation, the gory details that might spill out. The newspaper fragment was horror enough. He buried himself in physical labor, digging post holes for a new paddock fence with punishing intensity, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the post driver a desperate attempt to drown out the questions screaming in his head. What did she see? How much did she understand? What was done to her before the fire? The fragmented phrase from Animal Control echoed, "Owner unavailable." Was Miller the victim, or something else? The tension coiled within him, a spring wound too tight. He snapped at the tractor when it wouldn't start, kicking the tire, a surge of irrational fury blinding him. He stopped talking to Gracie during their evening vigils. The words felt hollow, inadequate against the enormity of her silent testimony. He'd sit on the upturned bucket outside her paddock, shoulders hunched, staring at the ground, the weight of her unspoken past and his own unresolved grief pressing down, crushing the air from his lungs. He felt like a fraud, offering sanctuary while ignoring the bloodstains on the threshold. Gracie felt the shift. Her tentative approaches became hesitant. She'd stand near the fence, watching him, her dark eyes reflecting his withdrawn posture, his clenched jaw. She'd nicker softly, a questioning sound, but when he didn't respond, didn't lift his head, she'd eventually drift away, grazing with less enthusiasm, her ears flicking back towards him with a frequency that spoke of unease. The connection they'd painstakingly built, the shared breath, the trust in a touch, felt thin, fraying under the strain of the unspeakable truth. Then came the rain. Not a storm this time, but a slow, gray drizzle that started mid-morning and settled in for the day. A monotonous drumming on the shed roof, soaking the world into shades of damp charcoal. Ben was mending a section of paddock fence. The wet would slick under his gloves, his mood as sodden as the ground. Gracie stood nearby, under the partial shelter of the shed's overhang, head low, seemingly dozing. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the rain was the only sound. He reached for a nail, his fingers fumbling on the wet metal. It slipped, clattering loudly onto the metal toolbox lid. A sharp, sudden clang. Gracie exploded. It wasn't the panicked whirlwind of the storm night. This was pure, unadulterated terror unleashed. A scream tore from her throat, raw, guttural, a sound of pure agony and mindless fear. She didn't rear. She launched herself sideways, crashing into the paddock fence with terrifying force. Wood groaned. She rebounded, stumbling, eyes wide and white-rimmed, seeing nothing in the present. Her hooves scrabbled desperately on the mud, churning it into brown soup. She screamed again, a sound that ripped through the drizzle and lodged like a knife in Ben's chest. She spun, searching for an escape that didn't exist, trapped in the flashback triggered by that single, sharp noise. The clang of metal. Like a stall door slamming, like falling debris. Gracie! No! Ben yelled, dropping everything, scrambling towards the gate. He didn't think. He moved. He unlatched it, flung it open, and stepped into the paddock, arms spread wide, trying to appear large, trying to block her frantic charge. Easy. Easy, girl. It's me. It's Ben. She didn't hear him. She saw a shape, a threat. She wheeled away from him, crashing into the fence again, the impact shuddering through the posts. She screamed, a sound of utter despair, her body a map of terror etched in sweat and mud and flying mane. Ben saw the raw panic, the absolute absence of her in those eyes. She was back there, in the fire, in the smoke, in the moment her world ended. Something inside Ben shattered, not with a bang, but with a terrible, silent rending. The dam holding back his own ocean of grief, guilt, and helpless rage finally burst. He stopped trying to calm her. He stopped yelling. He just crumpled. Right there in the mud of the paddock, the cold rain soaking through his clothes, he dropped to his knees. The weight of it all, Sarah's absence, the echoing emptiness of the farm, the relentless ache of loneliness, and now this beautiful, broken creature reliving hell because of a sound he'd made, it crashed over him. A sob, ragged and torn, ripped from his throat. Then another. He buried his face in his muddy hands, his shoulders shaking violently. He cried for Sarah. He cried for Gracie. He cried for the senseless cruelty that had scarred them both. He cried for the overwhelming helplessness of being unable to fix any of it. The tears were hot against the cold rain, a torrent he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. He wept openly, brokenly, the sound raw and ugly, mingling with the drumming rain and Gracie's terrified screams. He didn't see her stop. He didn't see the moment the frantic spinning ceased. He was lost in his own private inferno. But he felt it. A shift in the air. A sudden cessation of the desperate scrabbling hooves. Then silence. Only the rain. Ben lifted his head, gasping for breath, tears and rain blurring his vision. Gracie stood a few feet away, trembling violently from nose to tail, her sides heaving, her coat plastered dark with sweat and rain. But she was still. Her eyes, wide and shocked, were fixed on him. Not through him. On him. On the man kneeling in the mud, weeping like his heart had been torn out. The raw terror in her eyes had morphed. Not gone, but overlaid with confusion, recognition. The sheer, unexpected vulnerability of his breakdown had pierced the veil of her flashback. She took a single, hesitant step towards him. Her nostrils flared, sucking in the scent of his tears, his despair, mingling with the rain and mud. Another step. She stopped just out of reach, her head lowered, stretching her neck towards him. Her breath, still rapid and shallow, puffed warm clouds into the cool air. She made a soft sound. Not a nicker. Not a snort. A low, questioning murmur deep in her chest. Woof. Ben didn't move. He just knelt there, exposed, shattered, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, tears still tracing paths through the mud on his cheeks. He met her gaze, his own eyes red-rimmed, filled with a pain as profound as hers. He saw his own brokenness reflected in the depths of her dark eyes. Not a ghost of memory this time. The real, raw, present agony. They weren't rescuer and rescued. They were two shipwrecks washed up on the same desolate shore. He didn't speak. Words were ash. He simply held her gaze, letting her see it all. The grief, the guilt, the crushing weight of the world, the helpless love he felt for her despite everything, because of everything. He slowly lifted one mud-smeared hand, palm open, trembling, towards her. Gracie flinched, a tiny recoil. But she didn't run. She stretched her neck further, her velvety muzzle hovering inches from his fingers. Her nostrils flared again, wide and pink, sampling the salt of his tears, the earthiness of the mud, the scent of his utter desolation. Her breath hitched. She made the soft sound again. Woof. Then, with infinite, heartbreaking slowness, she closed the distance. Her muzzle touched his open palm. Not a nudge. Not an exploration. A resting. The warmth of her breath, the incredible softness of her skin against his calloused, muddy hand. It was the lightest touch, yet it carried the weight of a universe. She let her head sink lower, her muzzle pressing more firmly into his palm, her eyes closing halfway. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped her, vibrating through her body and into his hand. It wasn't a sigh of fear anymore. It was a sigh of surrender, recognition, shared burden. Ben's breath caught. He didn't dare move. He felt the tremor still running through her, felt the rapid beat of her pulse where her jaw rested against his wrist. But beneath the fear, beneath the memory, he felt something else. A profound, anchoring stillness. A connection forged not in shared joy, but in shared devastation. He let his forehead sink forward, gently, until it rested against the smooth plane of her forehead, just above her eyes. Rain dripped from his hair onto her forelock. Her warmth seeped into his chilled skin. They stayed like that, kneeling man and trembling horse, forehead to forehead, hand to muzzle, in the cold, steady rain. The storm wasn't outside. It was inside. And for the first time, they weren't weathering it alone. The fragment of newspaper burned in his pocket, a testament to horror. Gracie's trembling body under his hand was a testament to survival. His own tears were a testament to the unbearable cost of love in a broken world. But in this moment, in the shared silence broken only by the rain and their ragged breathing, a single fragile truth emerged from the wreckage. The deepest shelter isn't found in walls, but in the broken spaces where two shattered souls finally recognize each other. The question hanging in the rain-soaked air wasn't about the past, or the fire, or even survival anymore. It was simpler, heavier, echoing in the space between their shared breath. Can silence hold this much? The rain stopped by evening. Not with a dramatic clearing, but with a slow, exhausted sigh, the clouds retreating to reveal a sky washed pale and tender. The air smelled of soaked earth and bruised grass, the scent thick and alive in Ben's lungs as he walked back to the farmhouse, his boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. Gracie trailed behind him, not at the end of a lead rope, but by choice, her hooves making wet, muffled sounds in the mud. She stopped at the gate to the main yard, as she always did, but this time she didn't tense. She just stood there, watching him, her dark eyes reflecting the last watery light of dusk. Ben paused, halfway to the porch. He didn't turn around. He didn't call her. He simply waited, his breath fogging slightly in the cooling air. A beat.
Ooh, Ben.
Crunch. A single step forward. Ben still didn't move. Crunch. Crunch. Gracie crossed the gate's threshold, not with the stiff-legged terror of before, but with a slow, deliberate curiosity. Her ears pricked forward, her head low, nostrils flaring as she tested the unfamiliar ground. She stopped a few feet behind him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her damp coat, smell the rain still clinging to her mane. He turned then, just enough to see her in his periphery. She wasn't looking at the barn. She was looking at him. Something inside his chest, something that had been clenched tight for months, loosened. Just a fraction. He walked the rest of the way to the porch. Gracie followed. The days that followed were not miracles. There were no grand gestures, no sudden healings. The newspaper fragment remained in Ben's dresser drawer, tucked beneath a stack of Sarah's old letters, not forgotten, but no longer burning a hole in his pocket. Gracie still refused to go near the main barn, but she no longer froze at the sight of it. She would stand at the edge of the yard, ears flicking, watching it with a quiet wariness, as if acknowledging its presence without surrendering to the fear. Ben stopped avoiding it, too. He began leaving the doors open during the day, airing out the lingering ghosts. He didn't push Gracie to enter, but sometimes, when he was inside mending tack or organizing tools, he'd glance up and see her standing at the threshold, one hoof resting just over the line, testing. They found new rhythms. Mornings began not with the grim determination of survival, but with the quiet comfort of routine. Gracie waiting at the paddock gate, her knicker soft and expectant, Ben rubbing sleep from his eyes as he measured out her grain. Evenings were spent not in silence, but in quiet conversation, Ben talking about nothing and everything, Gracie's ears twitching as she lipped at her hay. And then there were the storms. The next one rolled in a week later, thunder growling in the distance, the air thick with the promise of rain. Ben had braced himself, ready for the panic, the screaming, but Gracie surprised him. She startled at the first crack of thunder, her head jerking up, eyes wide. But instead of spinning into terror, she turned towards the farmhouse, where Ben stood on the porch. She didn't bolt, didn't scream. She just stood there, trembling, her gaze locked onto him. Ben didn't hesitate. He walked out into the rain, straight to her paddock, and unlatched the gate. Gracie met him halfway. He led her not to the barn, but to the old three-sided shelter near the back pasture, a small, open space with a roof but no walls to trap or confine. She followed him inside, her breath hot and rapid against his shoulder, her body tense but not frantic. The storm raged around them, lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the ground, but inside the shelter, it was just the two of them, standing side by side, watching the rain sheet across the fields. Ben rested a hand on her neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her damp coat. "It's just noise," he murmured. Gracie exhaled, long and slow, her muscles gradually loosening. She leaned into his touch, just slightly. The storm passed. The world kept turning. Summer arrived in earnest, thick with humidity and the drone of cicadas. The fields grew lush, the fences lined with Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susans. Gracie's coat gleamed under the sun, her body filling out, her movements fluid and strong. She no longer looked like a ghost. She looked like a horse, alive, present, here. One evening, as Ben sat on the porch steps shelling peas, Gracie wandered over and nudged his knee, her muzzle velvety against his skin. He held out a pea pod, and she lipped it from his palm, crunching thoughtfully. "You're spoiled," he told her, but his voice was warm. She blew a soft, hay-scented breath into his face, then turned and ambled back to her grazing, tail flicking contentedly. Ben watched her go, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. It wasn't happiness. Not exactly. But it was something close. Something like peace. The question lingering in the golden evening light wasn't about the past anymore. It wasn't about fire or fear or the scars that would never fully fade. It was simpler than that. What comes after survival? The old truck's engine coughed twice before roaring to life, the sound echoing across the dew-drenched fields as Ben backed out of the driveway. He left the windows down, the early August air still cool enough to carry the scent of cut grass and damp earth. Gracie stood at the paddock fence, watching him leave, her ears pricked forward. She didn't pace, didn't call after him, just stood there, calm and sure, knowing he'd return. That simple trust, knowing, was something Ben still wasn't used to. He drove into town for supplies, the kind of mundane errand that had once felt like a chore. Today, though, the rhythm of it soothed him. The rumble of tires on gravel, the way the sunlight slanted through the oaks lining the road, the familiar creak of the truck's suspension as he pulled into the feed store parking lot. Inside, the store smelled of molasses and leather, the same as it had for decades. Ben grabbed a bag of grain, a new hoof pick, and, on impulse, a small box of sugar cubes from the counter display. The clerk, an older woman with a sun-weathered face, smiled as she rang him up. "Heard you took in that Miller mare," she said, sliding the hoof pick into a paper bag. Ben stiffened, his fingers tightening around the sugar cubes. The name Miller still sent a jolt through him, even now. The clerk didn't seem to notice. "She doing all right?" Ben exhaled. "Yeah," he said, and realized it was true. "She's good." The woman nodded, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Arabians don't forget, you know. But they forgive." Ben didn't ask what she meant. He just took the bag, paid, and left. The truth came that afternoon, in the golden quiet of the barn aisle. Ben had finally convinced Gracie to step inside the main barn. Not into the shadows, not into the stalls, but just over the threshold, where the sunlight pooled in wide, warm rectangles on the swept concrete. She stood there now, nostrils flaring as she took in the scents. Old hay, saddle soap, the faint tang of metal from the tools hung on the wall. Her ears flicked back and forth, but she didn't bolt. Ben worked nearby, oiling a set of leather reins, letting her explore at her own pace. He didn't push, didn't coax. Just let her be. Then, out of nowhere, Gracie lifted her head. Her whole body went still. Ben followed her gaze. She was staring at the far wall, where an old corkboard hung, cluttered with faded show ribbons, receipts, and a photograph. Ben hadn't touched it in years. Hadn't even really seen it, not since before Sarah died. But now, in the slanting afternoon light, it stood out like a beacon. He crossed the aisle and took it down. The photo was small, curled at the edges, the colors washed with age. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside Sarah at some long-ago county fair. They were both grinning, sunburned and happy, arms slung around each other's shoulders. And beside them, Ben's breath caught. A horse. A bright bay gelding with a white star on his forehead and a mischievous glint in his eye.
Cow.
Sarah's heart horse. The one Ben had sold after her death because the sight of him had been too much to bear. He hadn't looked at this photo in so long. Hadn't let himself remember. Gracie stepped closer, her breath warm on his shoulder as she looked at the picture. Her muzzle hovered near the edge of it, as if she, too, recognized something. Then she did something extraordinary. She blew softly, gently, across the photo's surface. A quiet, deliberate breath, like a blessing. Ben's throat tightened. He didn't believe in signs, didn't believe in fate. But in that moment, standing in the barn aisle with Gracie's warmth pressed against his side and the photo trembling in his hands, he felt something shift. Scout had been Sarah's horse. Gracie was his. Not by accident, not by chance, but because somewhere, in the tangled mess of loss and grief and fire and fear, they had chosen each other. That evening, Ben sat on the porch steps, the photograph resting beside him. The sky blazed pink and gold, the first fireflies blinking to life in the tall grass. Gracie grazed nearby, her coat glowing in the fading light. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out the sugar cubes. "Hey!" he called softly. Gracie lifted her head, ears swiveling towards him. He held out a cube on his open palm. She ambled over, her steps unhurried, and lipped it delicately from his hand. As she crunched it, Ben reached up and ran his fingers through her forelock, the coarse hairs warm from the sun. "Good girl," he murmured. She exhaled, long and slow, her eyelashes fluttering. Ben didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if the scars, hers or his, would ever fully fade. But right now, in this golden, firefly-lit moment, that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was this. They were here. Together. Alive. The question lingering in the twilight wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the next step, the next breath, the next sunrise, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that, whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The first frost came on a morning so still, the world seemed to be holding its breath. Ben stepped onto the porch, his coffee steaming in the crisp air, and watched as his exhale curled white into the dawn. Across the yard, Gracie stood at her paddock gate, her copper coat darkened with dew, her breath making matching clouds in the cold. She didn't pace, didn't call for breakfast, just waited, watching him back, her ears pricked forward in quiet expectation. Something about the moment, the stillness, the shared breath in the cold, the way the rising sun gilded the edges of her mane, made Ben's throat tighten. He thought of all the mornings he'd woken to emptiness, all the days that had stretched before him, barren and endless, all the nights he'd wondered if the ache would ever dull. And yet, here they were. The truth was this. Horses don't heal in straight lines. Neither do humans. There is no magical moment when the past releases its grip. No sudden erasure of scars. No finish line where grief finally stumbles and falls behind. Healing is a spiral. You circle back. You retrace old wounds. You wake some days to find the ground steady beneath your feet, and others, The earth gives way without warning. Gracie still startled at sudden noises. Still hesitated at the barn door. Still carried the ghost of fire in the way her muscles locked when thunder rolled in from the west. Ben still caught himself turning to say something to Sarah, only to remember. Still woke some nights, his chest hollow, the silence pressing in like a weight.
But
Gracie now trotted to the fence when he called. Now rested her head against his shoulder when the world felt too heavy. Now stood steady as he buried his face in her neck, her warmth a silent promise. I'm here. You're not alone.
and Ben.
He laughed more now. Not the booming laughter of before, but a softer, quieter version. He found himself humming as he mucked stalls, talking to Gracie as if she could understand every word. He planted bulbs along the fence line because Sarah had loved daffodils, and because it felt like a kind of defiance, planting hope in the same soil that held his grief. Winter deepened. The fields turned to silver, the trees skeletal against the gray sky. Ben and Gracie settled into their rhythms, morning feedings with gloved hands, afternoons spent walking the fence lines to break the ice in the troughs, evenings by the wood stove, Ben reading aloud while Gracie dozed in her stall, her slow breath sinking with the crackle of the fire. One particularly bitter night, Ben brought an old fleece blanket out to the barn, draping it over Gracie's back as she lipped at her hay. "Don't tell the other horses," he muttered, smoothing the fabric over her withers. "You'll ruin my reputation." Gracie blew hay dust into his face, her dark eyes gleaming. Ben grinned. Spring returned, as it always does. The first green shoots pushed through the mud. The red-winged blackbirds trilled from the fence posts. The world softened at the edges. On the anniversary of Gracie's arrival, 2 years now, Ben led her to the back pasture, where the new grass grew thick and sweet. He unclipped the lead rope and let it fall. Gracie didn't bolt, didn't gallop, just turned her head to look at him, her ears swiveling forward, her gaze steady. Ben nodded toward the open field. "Go on," he said softly. She hesitated a moment longer. Then, with a sudden joyful toss of her head, she took off, not in panic, not in flight, but in pure, exuberant motion. Her mane streamed behind her, her hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that echoed Ben's own heartbeat. She ran until she was just a copper blur against the green, then wheeled and came charging back, sliding to a stop in front of him, her sides heaving, her eyes bright. Ben reached out, pressing his palm to her sweat-damp neck, feeling the wild pulse beneath her skin. Gracie lowered her head, resting her forehead against his chest, just for a moment. "Thank you," the gesture said. "Thank you," Ben answered silently. The truth, in the end, was simple. We don't heal by forgetting. We heal by remembering and choosing to go on anyway. By planting flowers in the scorched earth. By letting the broken parts of us be seen and loved and somehow, impossibly, made whole again. Gracie had carried the fire. Ben had carried the silence. And somewhere along the way, without either of them noticing, they'd set their burdens down. Not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer defined them. The last question wasn't a question at all. It was an answer. A quiet knowing, as sure as sunrise. Sometimes, the ones who save us are the ones who needed saving first. If this story moved you, don't let the journey end here. Subscribe for more heart-wrenching rescues and extraordinary bonds. Comment below. Tell us what moment touched you most. Follow for daily stories of courage and second chances. Press the bell icon so you never miss a new video. Because every creature, every single one, deserves a chance to run free again. See you in the next story.